I am really excited to be here this morning. We have some super exciting stuff to go over. My name is Robert Ingebretson. I'm a program manager on the WPF team. So WPF is just a more convenient way of saying Windows Presentation Foundation. So you've probably heard of Windows Presentation Foundation, if not before the conference, at least at the conference. We've been talking about it quite a lot. Windows Presentation Foundation is a new technology from Microsoft that allows you to build world-class user experiences. So this is pretty exciting today. I have a chance to talk to you guys about Windows Presentation Foundation from a new perspective. We haven't really had a chance to take this technology to a designer audience before, and so this is kind of the first time that we're doing that. And so if you have questions, please feel free to ask. If you have feedback, we would love to get your feedback. I would love your feedback after the session. Please feel free to come and find me and talk to me. Or after you go home, if you have a chance to sit down and play with it, we would love to know what you think. So feel free to send email or post on the forums, blog about it. Any way that you can think of to let us know what you're thinking, we would love to hear it. So as creative professionals, you have an enviable job. You get to do something that not many people get to do. You have a chance to exercise both halves of your brain in a very interesting way. One thing that we've seen is that the job of a creative professional is to take a creative idea and translate it into functional technology. This can be an amazing process. And in fact, it can be a lot of fun. It can even be inspiring. The finished product can be something that is remarkable. But it can also be kind of a hard process. Because if you're like most of us, chances are that you do not exercise both halves of your brain equally well. Is there anybody here who's ambidextrous? I'm just curious. You don't get that question very often, I imagine. I have a friend who is ambidextrous, and she can literally write with both hands. Here's some interesting trivia for you. Her handwriting is different. I don't know if this is the case for other people. She's saying that it is. I thought that was so weird. She has two handwritings. But most of us are not ambidextrous. Most of us have a tendency to either focus on one side or the other. We're either creative or technical, or mostly creative or mostly technical. If that's the case for you, then chances are that you have found yourself in a position where you work with a team of people who complement your skill set. And to be clear, great designs can still happen under those circumstances. There are still great designs that get produced by teams, but it is a lot harder. And the reason that we've seen that it's a lot harder is because you have a communication problem. There are translation errors along the way. So you're probably familiar with this, right? You have a situation where you come up with what you think is a fantastic idea, a great idea, it's your most creative idea, and as you toss it over the fence, or as you somehow try to represent that, you have the problem where the final product is not what you had anticipated. So our goal when we first began to define and come up with our vision for this platform was to address that problem head on. So the first step in addressing that problem was to get everybody speaking the same language. So if you can't tell, this is a Rosetta Stone. And while the Rosetta Stone does not actually contain embedded XAML, the concept is pretty much the same. We wanted everybody to end up speaking the same language. So you've probably heard a lot about this thing called XAML. Who's heard of XAML? This is a familiar term to most people now. XAML is X-A-M-L, pronounced XAML. The Z is, or the X is like a Z. As a designer, you should be super excited about what XAML can do for you. It's kind of an all-encompassing technology. So you can see I created a list here of some of the things that it covers. So it's things like layout controls, vector graphics, 3D graphics, effects, animation, and the list goes on and on. So I want you to think about what this means. You have a single format which allows you to do such a broad range of things. A single format that is this expressive. Now, as a designer, this has a really interesting impact on your work. This gives you the ability to actually create content that gets used or consumed directly in the project. So instead of relying on a developer or some other team member to take your idea and translate it into functional technology, you are able to produce that content directly. And the thing that you hand off to the developer or to other members of your team is the thing that actually ships in the product. Now, this is super exciting. And the thing, in fact, that we've seen with this is that designers become more creative, more productive, and more popular. They become more creative because they're able now to actually express their ideas directly. So their original conception, their most creative idea is the thing that actually ends up being produced. They're more productive because there's no longer this translation step. So I don't know if you've experienced this, but you probably have, where a lot of your time ends up being spent working with the developer or working with whoever it is that's translating your idea, showing them what you actually meant. There's sort of this back and forth that happens, so we've eliminated that. And I'm serious about this more popular thing. The developers on your team will like you more. And there's another side to being more popular, which is the fact that there is a huge demand for these skills right now. We get requests weekly, if not daily, for somebody, a designer, who has the skills to produce WPF content. If you have a chance, you should check out Darren David's talk. I believe it's right after this one. The session number is at the end of my slides. Darren David is going to walk you through the process he went through when creating the kiosk application for the North Face. Now, what's interesting about that is Darren began with absolutely no experience in WPF. And in 0 to 6 weeks, he was done with the prototype, and in 4 more weeks, he had completed the project. And I think you'll see also that it's extremely creative. There are super interesting visualizations and techniques that he's used inside of that application. So that's right after this session. So with that in mind, as a company, we recognize that there was great value in being able to share this format. And so we've created tools that actually address, or that actually are able to manipulate XAML directly. And the 2 premier tools that we have are Visual Studio, which is a tool that is targeted at developers, and Expression Interactive Designer, which is a tool that is targeted at designers. And actually the entire Expression suite, or at least Interactive Designer and Graphic Designer, are both able to produce XAML content. So I struggled a lot today, though, to figure out the best way to show off this technology. And I thought about using each of these tools. Both of them have their strengths. So I thought about showing you Visual Studio because it really allows you to get in deep and see what's going on with the content. I also thought about showing you Expression because Expression really is the tool that is targeted at designers. In the end, though, I actually made kind of an interesting choice, and I chose oh, sorry, I wanted to tell you this real quick. Before I talk to you about the tool that I chose, one thing that's great about XAML is that we are seeing tons of people plugging XAML into their tools. So we've already seen converters or plugins for a huge list of tools. This is actually available on Mike Swanson's blog. He's keeping a list of all of the plugins and converters that exist. So we've seen plugins and converters for a huge array of tools, and I want you to think about what this actually means to your workflow. This means that you can take the tools that you're most familiar with, that you're already using on a day-to-day basis, and you can produce XAML content, which you can then hand over directly to the developer on your team. So imagine how great this would be. What if every tool that you used ended up manipulating the exact same file format, and that was the exact same file format that you gave to your developer? And we are super close to getting there. So now let me talk to you about the way I actually want to show you the tool today. How many people are HTML hand coders here? Okay, so a pretty good number. How many of you know how to hand code HTML? I'm guessing that most people could raise their hand and say yes. In fact, the first thing that you do if you want to learn how to manipulate HTML or understand what's going on behind the scenes is you probably open up Notepad and you start with HTML, body tag, or whatever. This is what I did 2 or 3 weeks ago when my mom wanted to learn about HTML. We sat down, and the first thing we did was we opened up Notepad. And by doing that, she was able to really understand what was going on behind the scenes. So the choice that I've made today of how to show this to you is I want to use a tool called Split View. So Split View is a tool that you can download on my blog, and there's a link at the end of the slide. And it's extremely similar to a tool called XAMLpad, which ships as a part of our SDK. The great thing about Split View is it lets you type in content and you can see it parse and appear immediately. So there's a button. We'll set the alignment on this so it doesn't look quite so strange. Okay, so you can see split view is a pretty straightforward tool. Just real quick, a tour of this so that you know what's going on as I use it. Over here on the side is a clipboard. So these are the clips that I'll be using during the demo. I found that if I try to type stuff by myself, do you remember when I was little, I used to watch David Letterman with my dad, and he always had these spots where he'd try to dial phone numbers, and he couldn't do it. I thought that was so weird until I tried to type on stage. Then I realized that things are actually really normal to do every day, get really hard when you're trying to do it in front of lots of people. So here's the clipboard. These are all the clips that I'll cut and paste. These are different documents that are open that I'll show you. And then if there's an error, you'll notice that this little guy pops up and tells us what the error is. So this is a great way to actually understand what's going on behind the scenes. And we're going to walk through the creation of an entire application today. And I'm going to show you beginning to end how we built it. And as we do so, I'm going to walk through it with an eye to those features which would be most interesting to you as a designer. Okay, so let's briefly talk about the application that we're going to build. So I came up with this idea. I wanted to build something kind of fun, kind of unique for the application. And I worked hard on this. I was trying to think of something that would be interesting. And I came up with this thought. I had this thought that typically if you take your blog and you take your photos, say you've posted on Flickr or something, if you were to combine those, you would actually see like a cohesive story from end to end. And if you could actually lay those out on a timeline, I had this thought that you would actually see interesting patterns and you'd be able to sort of see the story of your life unfold. What actually happened, though, when I tried to do this, is my blog was a little bit stale, and I had gotten a new camera for Christmas. And so in the end, I had a bunch of blog entries and then a bunch of photos. So while I guess that's part of the design process, right, is that your best designs are not always happen on the first try. So for today, we are going to have a list that combines blogs and photos, but to actually make it interesting, I'm just selecting them randomly. So while I wish that the idea had turned out better, we'll go with random for today. So then here's the concept for the application. So we'll start with this list of blog entries and photos, this combined list, and then super simple. When you click on one of those, we'll display the whatever it is that you clicked on in a larger format in sort of this content area. And then obviously we want a different visualization for photos and a separate visualization for blog entries. So this is a really straightforward app. Kind of a fun app. It's similar to the kind of application that all of us have actually created and deployed on our own personal website. So I thought that was sort of a fun place to start, kind of the hello world of the designer portfolio. The other thing that you need to know about is this image. So I started off my demo construction process by looking for a texture. And I did a search for interesting texture. And this is what I came up with, and I actually was kind of taken by it. I thought this is a really cool image. So this is, as you can see, it's just a chalkboard. I actually paid $3 for this image, and so once I'd paid the $3, I was sort of committed. So this will become the central theme for the visual design of our application. So let's jump into the demo. Okay, so I'm going to drag this up a little bit so you can see what's going on. Can everybody read that? Everybody can see that? Okay. So the first thing that I want to do is we're going to start with sort of the basics. So layout, controls, and then we're actually going to hook up our data source. So the first thing that I'm going to do is grab this grid and paste that in there. So grid is a layout container that you will quickly fall in love with. It's super useful and super flexible. And I've actually turned this property on called Show Grid Lines. This is actually just a debugging property. I don't think you would ever actually want to ship showing the grid lines, but this allows you to see where we've placed the grid lines. Can you see that right here? There's sort of this faint line right there. Pay attention to that. I want to show you how a grid actually works. So inside of the grid, I have created these column definitions. So the first one, it kind of makes sense. I've said the width is 200 pixels in this case. And that kind of makes sense. You can see that it's 200 pixels. The second syntax here, though, is kind of an interesting one. That's what we call the star syntax. Star syntax says, take up whatever space is available. And if I have multiple columns with star syntax, so if I were to add another one in here, it means to share the available space. And the other great thing about this is that you can specify a ratio. So I can say, take up 3/4 of the space, or I guess that would be 2/3 of the space, because there's a total of 3 stars, and I'm taking up 2 there. And then the other value, which I'm actually not using, is this value called auto. And auto allows you to say, size the content. Take whatever space the content needs. Now you can define columns, and you can also define rows. And for our application, the layout is pretty simple, so we don't actually need any rows, so I'm not going to define any. Now this is just one of many layout panels, layout containers that come with you out of the box in WPF, for example. We also have support for a stack panel, canvas, all of the layout containers that you would expect to be there are there. So we're going to stick with grid. And the first thing that I want to do is I'm going to add some controls to our grid. So I've added 2 controls. So you can see I've added a list box, and then I've pinned that list box to this first column. And then I've added this special control, which is kind of an interesting control called a content control. And content control, if you are familiar with HTML, is kind of like a div. It just gives me a place to add content. And you can see that I've put that content control in column 1, but there's actually no visual representation of this, at this point of the content control. So now the next thing that I want to do might normally seem kind of intimidating. I want to hook up our data source. So the first thing that I'm going to do is add this XML namespace. So if that syntax looks like more than you would actually want to put in memory, that's fine. Typically, this is something you would cut and paste. And in fact, I always cut and paste this. It's actually pretty easy to understand what's going on here. But basically, what the syntax does is it says there's some external functionality, in this case, the data objects that we want to bring in. And it's just saying, bring that in. This gives me the ability to add these data sources. So I'm going to add these right here. So as a designer, this is probably not something that you would normally want to deal with, hooking up data. This is typically something that you leave for the guys that are handling the back-end stuff. So the thing to notice here is how easy it is for you to actually use this. So the developer has actually created functionality, and then this is the great thing. He has exposed that functionality as a regular tag that anybody can understand. So we have 2 tags here. One is called Flickr Photos, and in that tag I have the API key, which you need, and then username. And Carlos Luis is a favorite of mine on Flickr. I'm actually going to do my own photos, though, so we'll change that to be Ingerbretson. And then blog entries. So this is just the URL to my blog. It could be any blog. And the great thing is that the developers handle these details for me. And I don't know why I'm saying the developer. The truth is it was me, but it could have been the developer. Okay, and then the next thing that I want to do is I'm actually going to hook these up to the controls. So to set the data context for the list box, all I do is I set the item source property to be a binding to that data source. And then for the content control, I'm going to set this to be a binding to the list box. And I don't know if you can see this, but when I click on one of these objects, if you can see up in the very top corner there, it actually is setting the content on the content control. Okay, so I promise this is as technical as it's going to get today. The rest of everything that we do is going to be fun and visual. But we had to get the nuts and bolts out of the way first because I wanted to show you everything that you need to do to build this application from beginning to end. So with that, we are done with the nuts and bolts. Okay, so the next thing that I want you to realize is that data does not need to be boring. That may seem kind of boring. I acknowledge that. It was nuts and bolts. But data does not need to be boring. And in fact, the goal of ours was that you can manipulate data as a designer in the way that you think about data. So you can think of data objects rather than thinking of them as strange XML strings or arbitrary objects that are stored in memory. You can think of them as a visual concept. So when you add say a Flickr photo into a list box, you can actually think of how you want that Flickr photo to look. You can think of the visualization for that Flickr photo. And the concept that allows you to do this is called data templates. So this allows you to actually define the template or define the look and feel for what the data looks like inside of your application. So I want to do that. So let's go to, okay. So we're back on screen? Okay. So let me show you what a data template looks like. Okay. So a couple things to note here. The first thing is that that we're still defining this all in XAML. So this is just the regular concepts that you're used to. So we've already used we've already used a grid. If you wanted to, you could use a grid inside of here. We've already used controls. You could use controls inside of here. I'm actually using two elements. One is called a border. So a border is an element that does that. It just draws a border, fills it with whatever color you want. So I've set the background on it. And you'll notice that when I set the background, I did so with a hexadecimal number that had 8 characters in it instead of the regular 6. Now this is something you'll be super excited about. All color representations in WPF actually give you the ability to specify an alpha channel. So in this case, the 2 Fs at the beginning mean that I am fully opaque. So there's no transparency in this color. And then the rest of these are just the color that I've chosen. And then the thing that where the magic happens here is in this image tag. So here I've set the source property to a binding to square thumbnail URL. Square thumbnail URL. So this is a property that the developer defined for me, and now I'm binding to that, and that simply is the source for that property. So you'll notice that if I come down here, I'm going to add this to the resources section of the list box so that it applies only to the list box. And when I add that, you'll see that instantly our photos become actually interesting photos. So now the way that you thought about that photo when you first thought of it is as a photo. Now it actually looks that way. We need to do the same thing for a couple of other data objects. So let me show you how we're going to do that real quick. So the next one I want to show you is this guy. So this is what we're going to make our blog item look like inside of the list box. So in here, it's actually a really simple template. I have a single element, and it's just a text block. So there are a couple of properties to notice on this text block, though, that I think you will think are really cool. So the first of those is so they're all kind of at the bottom. So this text wrapping property, this allows you to specify the wrapping behavior on the text element. And then the one that I think is super exciting is the text trimming property. So this gives you that behavior where if you've run out of room for the text box, it'll actually go to ellipses for you. So when we add this back in, scroll down a little bit so you guys can see where I am. So I'm adding this again to the list box resources. Oh, somehow I got the wrong one there. Let's see. This guy. Okay, so when I add that in, now you'll notice that the foreground is just a transparent white color. So let me set the background property on the list box so that you can see what we've just created. Okay, so now you can see that I have created this visualization for each of our entries. Now the problem that we have is we still have all of the templates that we've created so far are just for the list box. We still haven't created templates that apply to the content area. So we're going to do that really quickly also. And we're going to do that by going through exactly the same steps, except that these are a little bit more interesting. So let's see if I can scroll down a little bit more. Okay. So let me show you this real quick. This is a slightly more complex template, not a lot more complex, but slightly more complex. This defines what a Flickr item looks like inside of that content control. So you'll see that in here, I've used the grid, and now notice that I've set the background property on that grid to be this image brush. And the image source is pointing to a resource. Now that is a resource that we haven't actually defined yet, so we should get an error when I paste this. We're going to create that resource using Graphic Designer, and I'll show you that in just a second. Inside of this grid, we have an image, and the image this time, instead of binding to the thumbnail URL, is binding to the medium URL, so we'll get a bigger version of the picture. And then I've set this stretch property, and uniform says keep it stretched in proportion to the native proportions for that image. And then the other thing to notice on here is this thing called a render transform. So render transform says at the time that you render it, transform it in this way. So in this case, I'm applying a rotate transform. So let's paste that in here. Okay, and I didn't get an error, and I'm guessing that's because I didn't delete the resource that shouldn't be there. So let me do that real quick, so you can see the error. Okay. All right, ready? Error. Great. Okay, that's what we wanted. So now let me show you how we're going to actually create that resource. So I've created a background for the photo, and I created that in Graphic Designer. And Graphic Designer, in addition to the ability to edit pixel or raster-based formats like bitmaps and JPEGs and whatnot, it also has the ability to edit vector content. And if you didn't have a chance to see it yesterday, it actually does a really great job of combining the two. The thing that I want to do with this is I'm going to actually export this vector content to a XAML file. So I'm going to save this as photo.xaml, as you saw earlier. Now when I save this, this is super neat. It actually gives me a preview of what it's going to look like. Now this is being rendered using WPF, so this is the actual rendering of the XAML that you'll see. And then it also shows me the code that I have. So I can, if for some reason I wanted to go in and see what was going on behind the scenes, I could see it. You can see in here that it's actually pretty simple. It's just a single path. But that path is complicated enough that you would want a tool like Graphic Designer, or you could even use something like Illustrator and then export it from Illustrator to create that content. Okay, so I'm going to save that. The other thing to notice, though, real quick before I do, is that the key that it's using is photo_xpr, and it just took that from the file name of the file that I'm editing. So hit OK. So now if we come back into split view, when we ask this to parse again, so now that file exists, so we no longer get the error. And you can see that when we click on a photo, we actually get that content, that vector content, as the outline of our photo. And you can see it kind of has, like, I don't know, it's almost just a border, but it has like some sort of wavy lines to it or something. It looks a little bit more organic. Now, I showed this to my wife, and she said, and let me show it to you, large screen. I showed this to my wife, and she said, that looks weird because you've got a photo sitting on a chalkboard. Photos don't just stick to chalkboards. So I thought about that. I thought that was great feedback. And, you know, coming from your wife, you would be wise not to think otherwise. So I said I would make tape. So we're going to add some tape on top of the photo. So let me show you what's going on with the tape. Again, this is something that you might want to make in a tool like Expression Interactive Designer or in Expression Graphic Designer. But it's pretty simple, so I thought I'd just walk you through it real quick. So it's two rectangles. I've set the width and the height on them. Now on this one, I've actually set a negative margin, and this has the effect that it will actually pull it outside of the bounds of the layout container that it's in. So in this case, it's in a grid, and it will actually pull it outside of the grid. Then I've set a stroke and a fill, and each of these are kind of a gray color with an alpha channel. And then I've rotated it by applying this rotate transform. So when we paste that in there, let's see, I think it goes right there. And then we click on, now we have this kind of this fun tape that is on our images. So it looks a little bit more natural, I guess. Okay. The last the last data template that we have to create, you'll notice that if I click on the blog entries, I still just get sort of this funny text up in the corner. So the last thing that we need to create is the data template that corresponds to our blog entry. So I'm going to come down here and do that. Let me show you this one. This one is actually really simple, but it does something really neat. So this is taking advantage of a flow document scroll viewer. So the product actually ships with several of these flow document viewers. A flow document viewer takes a format called flow document, and it displays it. The amazing thing about a flow document, however, is that, first of all, it's super easy to create. You can create it inline. You can create it using just standard XAML. But a flow document has all of the best research and the best technology that Microsoft has to offer around a reading experience. So we will figure out, if you put something in a flow document, we will figure out the best possible reading experience for you given that content. This means we'll do things like pagination. We will apply columns if the content is too wide. We will give you super clear type rendered text. And we'll also give you a variety of ways to display that. So in this case, I'm using a flow document scroll viewer. So when I paste that in here, I put that in the wrong place? Yeah, I did. Okay, so when we put that in there, you'll notice that if I click on a blog entry, that I get this reading experience. Now, given the texture that we have, that reading experience is probably not ideal. And in fact, it doesn't really go with the theme. So the next thing that I want to show you is a technology called styling. And we're going to use styling to actually clean up this text and make it look more natural on the chalkboard texture. So let me show you what a style looks like. So if you come from an HTML background, styles as a concept will be really familiar to you. It's really similar to something like CSS, in that styles give you the ability to apply settings and properties on objects without directly touching that object. So it allows you to define in a central place property settings and then apply them and have them apply to multiple objects later on. So in this case, you can see that I've created a style for a flow document. And this flow document is the content inside of my flow document viewer. And here I've set a couple of properties. So I've set the text alignment. And then this one, the font family, this is super exciting. You'll notice that I've set this using this notation saying resources, whack, Ingebrigtsen and Nito. Now Ingebrigtsen and Nito, if you look in our resources folder, is a font. And actually, this is a font that I created on a tablet PC that is my very own handwriting. So a person who reads my blog entries using this application will actually be able to read my thoughts in my very own handwriting as processed by a tablet PC. So using this syntax, I'm able to embed that font inside of my application. Let me bring that back up so I can show it to you again. Oh. Okay. I'm able to embed that font inside of my application. In many fonts, if you create it yourself, obviously you have a license to that font, but many fonts that you can buy actually ship with a license that allows you to embed that font inside of your application. This gives you huge flexibility in the kind of text that you're able to show and some of the typographic features of an application that you might create. I've also set the line height on this, and then I've also created a style for hyperlink. And this style for hyperlink will give my hyperlinks kind of a yellow color so that you can distinguish them from the rest of the content. So I'm going to paste this style in here. And you'll notice now that if I click on an entry, we have it in this in my own handwriting, sort of this chalky white color. And it almost looks like I wrote that on an actual chalkboard. Thank you. Nice. Yeah, I was really excited about that too. Okay. So that's it for data templates. You can see, though, that we have a huge amount of flexibility with the way that we represent our data. So to take that concept and take it a little bit further, we can also use the same idea of templating for our controls. So when we were coming up with the idea of data templating, at the very same time, we were also trying to respond to a bunch of feedback that we'd received from customers saying that they wanted to define the visual representation for their controls. They wanted to define the look of their controls. And we realized that this templating concept is actually a perfect fit. And so in the same way that you can take an arbitrary data object and define a visual representation for that, you can take any control, or really even things beyond controls, anything that derives from the control base class, so it includes a large number of things, and you can apply a template to them and get the same technology. So this applies to everything from like a button to a scroll bar to a list box to even the window or page that defines the outer bounds of your content inside of your application. So the next thing that we're going to do is create some control templates. By the way, is everybody following along so far? Is this making sense so far? Okay. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create a template for list box. Now the way I do that is I set the list box, I set the template property on the list box, and inside of there I just add this control template. I showed you that because it's actually a really simple template. When we actually apply it, though, here, let me find my list box. When we actually apply it, you'll notice that in fact, here, let me show you this live. You'll notice that it didn't do a whole lot because the list box is already a really simple template to begin with. But it's a great way to see what's actually going on behind the scenes with templating. So inside of our control template, we have a scroll viewer. This gives me the ability to scroll the content. And then I have a single panel. This is a stack panel. And stack panel just lines things up in a stack, one on top of another. And then I've set this interesting property called isItemsHost. And when I set the isItemsHost property, that's telling the list box that this is the place where I want you to add the items. So it'll use this stack panel to contain all of our items. So that's pretty straightforward template. The effect that it had on our actual application is kind of small. So let me show you one that does a little bit more. This is the list box item template. So now you'll notice that in this case I'm combining two technologies that we've already talked about. So I'm going to use styles because I can't actually touch the list box item directly. By the way, the list box item is the container for each of the items inside of the list box. This is the guy that handles selection state. So because I can't touch the list box items directly, I'm going to use a style. So I'm combining the style technology to set the template property, and I'm going to set the template property to this control template, which is just a border with some padding and a corner radius. So again, I'll keep this in the list box. Ooh, didn't like where I put that. Let's see. Let's see if I. Oh, I was adding it above the resources. Sorry. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so this had the effect of kind of cleaning up our content, moving things into the middle a little bit more. You'll notice, though, that when I click on these guys now, I've lost selection. And so one of the really important things that you can do inside of a control template, or data template for that matter, which gives you the ability to actually provide some interactivity for the control, is this notion of triggers. Triggers are super cool. They give you a ton of flexibility in what you can do inside of a control template. So in this case, I'm creating a really simple trigger. On this trigger, I've set the property is selected, or sorry, I've created a condition. And that condition is when the property is selected becomes true, then I'm going to apply the trigger. So, and then when I apply the trigger, I'm saying find that border that we had inside of our template and set the background property to this kind of transparent black color. So let me add this and I'll show you how that works. Okay, so I paste that in there, and now you'll notice that when I select these guys, now we have sort of this nice transparent border on everything. Okay. The last template that I want to show you is a scroll bar template, and scroll bar is a much more complex control. So I'm actually not going to show you I could show you the whole template. It's just kind of long to walk through the whole thing, but the interesting thing to note here is that I've got two scroll bars. So I've got this scroll bar over here, and I've got this scroll bar. And so one of the great things that, that you have the ability to do inside of your application is to scope the resources that you create. So everything that I've done so far has been a very narrow scope as I've applied the resources. So you saw that as I created a data template for something that is in the list box, I added it to the resources section for the list box. Now I want to apply something that is more global. So I'm going to go up to the resources section at the top of the application for this top container. And I'm going to add this scroll bar style. And this actually is a great time to turn off the show grid lines property. Oh. Okay. So you'll notice now that we've created that scroll bar, and we get that same scroll bar in both places inside of the application. So this is a pretty simple scroll bar, but. Okay, so we're making progress. Our application, do you remember what it looked like at the beginning? We're making good progress along the way. Okay, so that's everything that I have for control templates. But it's a super powerful concept. This has proven to be something that people use over and over and over to create really interesting visualizations inside of their application. So things that move you. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is animation. So as an interaction designer, chances are that this is something that is near and dear to your heart. By the way, any questions so far? I realize that I'm fairly technical in this session. I have confidence that as technical designers, you guys could keep up. But I want to make sure that you're getting something out of this. So if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. Any questions? Okay. Save them for the end then. All right. Okay, so things that move you. So I want to talk quickly about animation. So one of the things that we've really invested a lot of time in is the ability to make 2D content, and 3D content for that matter, that you can animate in real time, and that and to create animations that that easily respond to user interaction. So. The other thing is, to really create rich 2D content, we have created a library of what we call effects. So I want to show you both of these things real quickly in the demo. Okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is apply some effects. So the first thing I'm going to do is apply this drop shadow. So I'm going to do this inside of our listbox item template. So inside of the listbox item template, there's a content presenter. The content presenter is, like I said earlier, just a placeholder for the content, kind of like a div in HTML. So I'm going to apply a drop shadow to that content presenter, and that will have the effect of applying a drop shadow to whatever happens to be inside of the content. So let's find our listbox item. Okay, so here's my content presenter. I'm going to paste this drop shadow in, and you'll notice now that everything has this drop shadow. And I think that you will appreciate actually some of the ways that you can customize this drop shadow. If you come from a Photoshop background or otherwise, you see that I can adjust things like the softness, so I can make it super soft or not soft at all. I can also adjust the depth to do outrageous things. So I can send the drop shadow way over. We also have other effects. So kind of a fun one is the blur effect. So I can blur that guy. Oh, I didn't like that for some reason. Oh, it's because I've already got I'd have to create a collection if I want more than one in there. So I can blur that guy. Anyway, we'll stick with our drop shadow for now. The other thing that I'm going to do here really quickly, and I've shown you this before, is I'm going to add a transform to this content presenter. And this will come into play in just a second when we start animating things. So why didn't that work? Oh, it's still in my bitmap effect. Okay. So I've applied this transform, and actually this transform right now, you'll see it's a translate transform, which will just shift something over. Right now I've set both the x and the y to 0, so the net effect of this guy right now is nothing. And I'm going to do the same thing to the shadow. So I'm going to set its opacity to 0, because I actually want to animate these properties in response to mouse over. So let me show you what an animation looks like. So like I said, one of our goals was to make animations that can respond to user interaction. And one of the best ways to do that is to create animations that actually respond to property changes, because much of user interaction can be defined by property changes or also events. So these also will respond to events. In this case, I'm going to respond to the isMouseOver property. So the isMouseOver property becomes true when the mouse goes over the object that this is being applied to. And what I'm saying here is that when the isMouseOver property becomes true, that we want to fire this trigger. And inside of the trigger, I've defined what's called a storyboard. Now, again, this is syntax that would likely be generated for you using a tool, or something that if you were hand coding is something that you would probably cut and paste. But it's pretty simple to understand what's happening. So inside of the storyboard, we have a collection of animations. And a double animation has the ability to animate a property that is of type double. So double is a numeric value, so something like, in this case, the drop shadow opacity is a double. So what I'm saying is find the drop shadow, which is what we named our bitmap effect, and then animate its opacity to 0.7, and do that in a duration of 0.1 seconds. And then I've got other storyboards here that affect the x and y properties on the transform. And so the effect of firing this guy is that it's going to turn the drop shadow on, because it'll animate the opacity, and then it'll shift the content up. So let me show you when we apply this what happens. I guess right in here is our triggers. So I'm going to paste that in there. Okay, now you'll notice that when I mouse over this guy, that we get sort of that fun animation. But if you have a keen eye, you've noticed that there's a problem, because things have become stuck up there. So the thing to notice is that inside of the animation, inside of the trigger, we defined enter actions. And enter actions get applied when the property becomes true. I also want to show, so the thing that we'll do now is apply some exit actions, and these will basically have the effect of undoing our animation. And the neat thing about these two animations is that because they're defined on the same trigger, they have an awareness of each other. And so the result is that we can have this cool handoff behavior where for instance, if isMouseOver were to become false halfway through the animation, we could undo the animation using the exit action. So now we have sort of this nice effect where as we mouse over things, they sort of move in and out. If I can do that fast enough, you'll see that, well, you'll see that there's that nice handoff behavior with the animations. Okay, so this is our application, and I think it's pretty cool. We just did that in, I don't know, I think it's about 150 lines of XAML. Some of that XAML is not stuff that you would actually want to code by hand. If you were doing it in Notepad, or if you wanted to do it by hand, if you wanted to get going before there was a tool available to you, you could do it in Notepad. You might want to cut and paste some of this stuff. Like I said, this will all be available on my blog. Okay, so there's one more thing, though, that I wanted to show you with the application. So if you remember this slide from earlier, you'll notice that there's a word on here that you may have thought was just me wanting to finish a slide, but is actually a very intentional word, and a word that I think is worth pointing out, and that is the word etc. So one of the great things about XAML is it is highly extensible. So let's talk a little bit more about the workflow process that your team is probably going through. Chances are that as a creative professional, or as a technical designer, you are handling a lot of the design, but there are times when you really want a developer to plug in, and he needs to come in and give you extra functionality. So even if maybe XAML just doesn't do what you need to do at this point. So one of the great things that we've done is we've created a way for you to extend the functionality of XAML in a way that you as a designer can consume it directly. And you saw this earlier with the data tags that I created. So a developer created those and was able to just give those to me. and then I just had the tags and could fill in my username. Similarly, a developer is able to provide functionality to you for creating visual or interactive content. So when I was putting this demo together, Kevin, who is actually a program manager on our team, but was acting as a developer at this time, saw what I was doing and he said, hey, I've got something that will make that application really come alive. And so I sat down with him and I saw what he had, and I was really excited about it. And I think you guys will think it's really neat too. By the way, this is a picture of Kevin that he actually gave me. When I asked him for a picture, he said, should I use my hot or not photo? And I said, of course you should use your hot or not photo. So this is Kevin's hot or not photo. You can go, I guess, and rate him if you want. So let me show you what Kevin gave me. So Kevin gave me a really exciting panel that he calls DynaPanel. And the great thing about DynaPanel is that it has this really organic movement as I relay things out. So you'll notice that I've replaced the scroll bar here with a grid splitter. But just by plugging in Kevin's panel, I'm able to get this really cool organic feeling to my content. And you'll see that I still get all of my effects that we defined earlier. As I click on things, the app is functioning exactly as it was before. And then other than adding that grid splitter, the only change that I needed to make was to add Kevin's DynaPanel inside of the control template for the list box. So you'll see that right here I've edited out the stack panel, which we had before, and I've added the DynaPanel. And the great thing is that he's provided these properties on the DynaPanel for me that actually describe the interaction. So right now you'll see we have kind of a medium speed. If I really wanted to slow things down, I could set the attraction way low. Then I kind of have this slower. If I wanted to go crazy, I could turn up the attraction. And then we have sort of this like extra bouncy, kind of more rigid bounce to things. And then he also has this dampening property. And dampening is what slows things down, so you actually get kind of crazy, and probably take that further if you wanted to. But the thing I wanted you to notice is how easy it was for me to use that. So this is a way that a developer can plug into your creative process. I think the easiest way for you to think about this is you're probably familiar with plugins for something like Photoshop or Illustrator. So this is plugins in Photoshop or Illustrator is functionality that you would get from the web or you would buy from a producer. And you would plug that into Photoshop or Illustrator, and you would get new functionality that allows you to be creative in new ways that you hadn't thought of before. And we expect that there'll be a growing library of these kinds of components that people create. And you'll be able to download them, buy them, use them inside of your application to really add to the functionality of your application. OK. So that's it for that application. I will put the source up for that, but that's cool, right? We created that right here on stage. Okay. Not that I was fishing for that, but thank you very much. We created that right on stage in, like, I don't know, what did I say earlier? 150 lines. I haven't actually counted. But roughly 150 lines of XAML. And that's something that I think probably anybody in here could recreate within a couple of days. I mean, literally, it's easy to come up to speed with this stuff, and there are lots of samples, and there are lots of examples you can learn by doing. I wanted to show you one more demo real quick. So this is, after I created this, I realized that I had failed to show you two of the most exciting pieces that are available to Designer inside of WPF. So I wanted to show you quickly how 3D and media are integrated directly into the platform. And because they're part of XAML, because they're part of the language definition, you can use them interchangeably with the rest of the platform. You have this wonderful integration with everything that you're doing. So this is a whole new version of this application, and it's actually running over on this computer. So this is a whole new version of this application that I created. The other thing is I wanted you to walk away really feeling like you can get creative, you can be creative with what you can do in WPF. So this is a breakfast cereal themed version of the application. Let me show you this full screen. So this is breakfast themed version. Right here you can see that this is the first photo, I guess, that it retrieved from Flickr. So on the Good Morning Crunch box. And this is a 3D object. I created this using a tool called XAM 3D, made by Electric Rain. You'll notice that if I choose some content over here, and then click on the cereal box, that it flips, and you can have that experience which we all love so much of reading the back of a cereal box. And that is actually content coming from the internet, from my blog, on the back of this virtual cereal box. And by the way, that movie, which I guess I forgot to set on repeat, those clouds in the background, that's a movie. And the thing to note there, well, here, let me just show you, is that when I first did this, the clouds were way too bright. And so, right here, the clouds were way too bright, so I was just able to set the opacity on those clouds, and I was able to drill back the saturation on those, and in fact, I can show you what it looked like before. Now, instead of having the sort of the neon clouds, which I had before, I ended up with like sort of the Mario Brothers clouds. So this is what I had before. I set the opacity on those, and I get sort of this nice, relaxed cloud scene instead of the intense blue. All right, where did I put my clicker? Okay, so that's what I had today in terms of demos. The thing that I wanted you to really walk away with today is an understanding that there is big opportunity here. Like I said earlier, we get daily requests for people who are looking for ways to, or looking for people who are familiar with this technology. And as designers, you have a critical role here. You have the ability to come up with the creative ideas and turn those into the technology that really excites people. We've built a platform for you, essentially. We've built a platform that we think you can get a lot of value out of. And everybody is super excited about the kinds of things that we're producing. I want you to take a minute and just think about the things that you've seen so far. In just some of the demos that you saw in the keynote today. Those are the kinds of opportunities that are available for you as a designer using WPF. And so with that, actually, real quickly, you might be wondering, what are the next steps for you? So first thing that you can do is there are more sessions for you to attend to learn more about WPF and WPFE. I have a slide that lists some of those. Go to Darren David's talk today. It's right after this one. Also, check out the WPFE talk today, which I believe is this afternoon at like 3. The other thing that you can do is play with WPF. So everybody received the bits on a DVD. Go home, install that, play with this stuff. I'll post all these samples. Get in there and play with it and have fun with it. I think that you guys will find that it's super fun. You can do stuff that you didn't expect to do or would have been extremely hard to do in other platforms. And then, like I said earlier, we really want your feedback. So please make a point of letting us know what we can change, what we can do. If you work with the expression tools, especially with Interactive Designer, we would love to know what we can change to make that easier for you. We are taking the time right now to really evaluate the user experience in that tool. And so your feedback would be invaluable to us. And here are additional resources. So there's a couple of sessions that you can check out. Feel free to contact me. There's my email address. And there's my blog. And I'll post all of this stuff on my blog. And so with that, thank you very much. Are there any questions? Feel free. Go ahead. What's that? Put the last slide back up. The last slide? Oh, I can't do that. Could somebody put the last slide back up? Okay. I think there's a microphone if somebody has questions. I saw a hand over here, too.
I had a question regarding the background of the photo while you were showing it. That was just scaling, right, at that time?
Yeah, so...
is there any sort of a scale 9 functionality where you can keep the corners but scale them?
So like a 9 grid or a scale 9.
Yeah.
So you can actually recreate that functionality pretty easily. We don't have... at one point, we thought about a visual brush that would do that for you. There's samples that will show you how to create a scale 9 functionality using a grid pretty easily. So you can definitely recreate the functionality. There's no native support for it. Go ahead.
Hi, can you remind us where the split view application is available online?
So the split view application, so there's two ways to get that. One is it's really similar to an application called XAMLpad, which is available as a part of the SDK. Or if you actually want split view with some of the templates and snippets that I had in my application today, I'll post that on my blog, and I'll actually post the source code for that. It's actually a surprisingly simple thing to do to write that kind of an application. Any other questions? Were you guys able to follow this today? Did you feel like you got a better understanding of what's going on under the covers? Okay. Any other questions? Technical questions about how I did something if I didn't cover it? I'm happy to go into tips and tricks, techniques, anything like that. All right, well, thank you very much.